Texas Hill Country, 1878. Owen Ingram stepped onto the warped porch of his cabin, clutching his wailing 6-month-old son against his shoulder. The full moon illuminated the rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite, a beautiful landscape that now seemed like a prison. 3 weeks a widower, and he hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since burying his Eliza. The baby's cries pierced the night air, echoing his own inner anguish. "Hush now, Daniel," he whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion. At 25, Owen had once been the picture of frontier vigor, tall and broad-shouldered with wheat-colored hair that caught the sun and eyes as blue as a summer sky. Now those eyes were shadowed by dark circles, his lean face gaunt with grief. He'd come to believe that the frontier was no place for tenderness. Life here required hardness, the ability to weather drought, disease, and death without breaking. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, not when survival demanded everything. He'd learned that lesson when influenza took Eliza just days after she'd given birth to their son. Owen bounced the red-faced infant gently, his calloused hand looking impossibly large against the tiny back. "I know, little man. I miss her too." His throat tightened. What Daniel needed was his mother's gentle touch, not the rough hands of a cattle drover who'd spent more time with longhorns than people. The cabin door of his nearest neighbor, barely visible through the mesquite trees 50 yards away, swung open, spilling lamplight into the Texas night. Owen tensed. He'd barely spoken to the young widow who'd moved in 3 months ago. Her husband had been killed in a cattle-rustling incident before they'd even unpacked their wagon, leaving her alone on the edge of nowhere. As the figure approached through the moonlight, Owen considered retreating inside. He didn't need anyone's pity, and he certainly didn't need to burden a stranger with his troubles. But Daniel's cries had reached a fever pitch, and Owen was at the end of his rope. "Evening, Mr. Ingram." Her voice was soft, but carried across the yard with surprising clarity. "Ma'am," he responded stiffly, trying to quiet the screaming child. Zara Thornton stepped into the moonlight, her chestnut hair falling in loose waves around her heart-shaped face. At 22, she had the kind of beauty that seemed out of place on the frontier, delicate features, and large hazel eyes that reflected both strength and vulnerability. Her simple blue calico dress was practical, but she wore it with a grace that spoke of her Eastern upbringing. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, hesitating at the edge of his property. "But I couldn't help hearing." She gestured toward Daniel, whose face was now an alarming shade of crimson from the force of his screams. "He's just colicky," Owen said defensively. "Been this way since." He couldn't finish the sentence. Zara nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Let me hold him." It wasn't a question, and something in her steady gaze broke through Owen's wall of isolation. Without a word, he handed over his son. The moment Daniel settled against Zara's shoulder, his cries began to soften. She hummed a gentle lullaby, swaying slightly as she patted his back. Within minutes, the baby's screams had reduced to hiccuping sobs, then to quiet whimpers. Owen watched in stunned silence. "How did you?" "My sister had 4 little ones back in Pennsylvania," Zara explained, still gently patting Daniel's back. "I practically raised the youngest 2 after she fell ill." Her eyes clouded briefly. Sometimes babies just need a different set of arms. For the first time in weeks, Owen felt something other than grief and exhaustion. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" The invitation surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I'd like that," she said simply, still cradling Daniel against her shoulder. Inside the cabin, Owen lit a lamp and stirred the banked fire in the small iron stove. The one-room structure was Spartan but clean. A bed stood in one corner, a crude crib beside it. A table with 2 chairs occupied the center, while shelves lined one wall with the necessities of frontier life. "It's not much," he apologized, suddenly seeing his home through a stranger's eyes. "It's a good, solid cabin," Zara replied, settling into a chair with Daniel, now sleeping peacefully against her chest. "You built it yourself?" Owen nodded, pouring coffee into tin cups. 2 years ago, before I married Eliza." The name still caught in his throat. "I'm sorry for your loss," Zara said quietly. "Truly. And I for yours," Owen replied, sitting across from her. "I didn't know your husband, but I heard he was a good man. Frank and I were married 6 months. Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened around the sleeping baby. "Barely knew each other, truth be told. It was an arrangement. His land, my father's investment. We were still learning to be companions when he died. The honesty of her statement hung between them, unexpected and refreshing. Most frontier folk buried their feelings as deep as their dead. Eliza and I grew up together back in Missouri. Owen found himself saying. Followed me out here when I claimed this land. She loved it at first, the wildflowers, the big sky. Then the drought came, and the fever. He trailed off, staring into his coffee. The frontier takes as much as it gives, Zara observed softly. They sat in companionable silence, two broken people sharing coffee, while a sleeping baby bridged the space between them. That night, Owen slept for 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time since Eliza died, with Daniel peacefully asleep in his crib. The next evening, when Daniel's cries started again, Owen hesitated only briefly before walking the 50 yards to Zara's cabin. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been expecting him. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the wailing infant. Night after night, the ritual continued. Sometimes at his cabin, sometimes at hers. They spoke of small things, the weather, the garden Zara was attempting to cultivate in the harsh Texas soil, the 3 cows Owen was raising alongside his small herd of longhorns. On the 7th night, as Daniel slept in Zara's arms, she asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. What will you do when he's older? A boy needs more than a father can give alone out here. Owen stiffened. We'll manage. Of course you will, she said quickly. I just meant, I know what you meant. He interrupted, more harshly than he intended. You're thinking like everyone else, that I need to find a new wife. That Daniel needs a mother. That's not, well, I buried one wife already. I won't risk my heart again, not out here. He stood abruptly. The frontier isn't kind to families, Mrs. Thornton. It takes and takes until there's nothing left to give. Hurt flashed across Zara's face as she carefully handed Daniel back to him. You're wrong, Mr. Ingram. The frontier doesn't take everything unless you let it. As Owen walked home, Daniel fussing against his shoulder, he wondered why her words stung so sharply. 2 days passed without contact. Owen struggled through sleepless nights with Daniel, his pride preventing him from seeking Zara's help. On the 3rd day, as he was repairing a fence line near the property boundary, he spotted her kneeling in her vegetable garden, struggling to pull water from a clearly failing well. Without thinking, he set down his tools and crossed to her property. Your well's running dry, he observed. Zara looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun. The water level's been dropping for days. There was no accusation in her voice, despite his recent rudeness. Owen examined the well, frowning. The water table must have shifted after those spring rains. Mine's still flowing strong. I'll manage, she said, echoing his words from their last conversation with just a hint of defiance. Owen hesitated, then offered. I could run a line from my well to yours. It wouldn't be hard. Just need to trench it and lay some pipe. Surprise registered on her face. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's being neighborly. He paused. And I owe you an apology for the other night. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Ingram. Owen, he corrected softly. And I do. You've been kind to Daniel and me when you had every reason to mind your own business. A small smile touched her lips. Owen then. And you may call me Zara. Over the next week, Owen dug the trench for the water line while Zara watched Daniel. The baby had taken to her completely, giggling and cooing whenever she spoke to him. Watching them together stirred something in Owen's chest, a feeling he tried desperately to ignore. As spring gave way to summer, their lives became increasingly intertwined. Zara would watch Daniel while Owen tended to his cattle. In return, he repaired her roof before the summer thunderstorms and helped with the heavier tasks around her property. They took to sharing dinner most evenings, alternating between cabins. One evening in late July, as they sat on Owen's porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold and crimson, Zara asked about his plans for the future. I thought I'd expand the herd next spring, he said, Daniel sleeping peacefully in his lap. Maybe build onto the cabin. It's good land, she observed. Frank chose it for the water access and grazing potential. She hesitated. I've been thinking about selling. Going back east. Owen felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath him. Selling? But you've put so much work into the place. A woman alone can't make a go of it out here, she said quietly. Not really. You're not alone, he protested. You have, he stopped abruptly. Neighbors, she finished for him, a sad smile touching her lips. Yes, but for how long? You might decide to move on someday too. Everyone does eventually. Owen wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Wasn't this what he believed himself? That attachment was dangerous, that the frontier eventually took everything you loved? Yet the thought of Zara leaving made his chest constrict painfully. The next morning, as Owen was repairing a saddle on his porch, 3 riders appeared on the horizon. He recognized the lead man instantly, Clayton Reed, a cattle buyer from Austin who occasionally passed through the area. The other 2 were strangers, hard-looking men with the bearing of hired guns. Ingram, Reed called as they approached. Fine day, Reed, Owen acknowledged cautiously. What brings you out this way? Cattle season's months off. Reed dismounted, dusting off his expensive suit. Actually, I'm here about property, not cattle. Heard the Thornton place might be available. Owen's eyes narrowed. Who told you that? News travels. Widow on a frontier homestead. Most folk would bet on her selling out. Reed smiled thinly. I've got interest in developing this area. Water access makes these parcels particularly valuable. Mrs. Thornton hasn't made any decisions about selling, Owen said firmly. Reed glanced toward Zara's cabin. Perhaps I should discuss it with the lady herself. She's not at home. Owen lied, knowing full well that Zara was inside with Daniel. Something in Reed's expression shifted. Funny thing about frontier property rights, Ingram. A widow has to actively work the land to maintain her claim. If she can't prove continuous occupation and improvement, he shrugged. The territory has ways of reclaiming abandoned properties. The threat was thinly veiled. Owen stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against the porch post. Mrs. Thornton's property is being worked just fine. You can take your interests elsewhere. Reed's men tensed, hands drifting toward their holsters. For a moment, violence hung in the air like the promise of a thunderstorm. No need for unpleasantness, Reed finally said, mounting his horse. I'll be back in a month. Perhaps the widow will be more receptive to a fair offer then. He tipped his hat. Good day, Ingram. As the riders disappeared over the hill, Owen's mind raced. He needed to warn Zara. Inside his cabin, he found her singing softly to Daniel as she rocked him to sleep. The domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. We need to talk, he said urgently once Daniel was settled in his crib. He explained about Reed and his thinly veiled threats. Zara's face paled, but her voice remained steady. Men like that have been trying to bully women off their land since the first settlements. I won't be intimidated. It's not just intimidation, Owen insisted. Reed has connections. If he wants your land badly enough, he'll find a way to take it, legal or otherwise. What would you have me do? Sell to him before he steals it? Her chin lifted defiantly. This land is all I have left. Owen ran a hand through his hair in frustration. You could prove continuous occupation more easily if... He stopped, the implication of what he'd been about to suggest hitting him suddenly. If what? Zara prompted. If we joined the properties, he finished, his heart pounding. If we married. Silence fell between them, heavy with possibility. That's not a proper proposal, Mr. Ingram, Zara finally said, her voice carefully neutral. No, it's not, he agreed. And I'm not making one. I'm suggesting a practical arrangement for mutual benefit. You keep your land, Daniel gets a mother figure, and I get. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Peace and quiet when the baby cries. There was a hint of bitterness in her tone. That's not fair, isn't it? Zara stood, smoothing her skirts. Thank you for the warning about Mr. Reed. I'll consider my options. She moved toward the door. Good night. After she left, Owen sat at his table long into the night, replaying their conversation. He'd managed to insult her while trying to help, reducing what had grown between them to mere convenience. The truth, that the thought of her leaving filled him with dread, that Daniel wasn't the only one who'd come to depend on her presence, remained unspoken. For the next week, their interactions were stilted and formal. Zara still helped with Daniel, but the easy companionship they developed had vanished. Owen found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noting the sadness that had replaced the light in her eyes. Then came the night of the storm. August in Texas could bring violent weather, but this thunderstorm surpassed anything Owen had seen in years. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks while thunder rattled the windows of his cabin. Daniel screamed in terror at each thunderclap, inconsolable despite Owen's best efforts. Just before midnight, a particularly vicious lightning strike illuminated the whole valley, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. In its wake, Owen heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the splitting of wood and a crash from the direction of Zara's cabin. Without hesitation, he wrapped Daniel in a blanket, tucked him securely in one arm, and ran into the storm. Rain lashed at his face as he sprinted across the space between their properties. As he approached her cabin, his worst fears were confirmed. A massive oak had fallen directly onto the roof, partially collapsing the structure. "Zara," he shouted, pounding on the door with his free hand. When there was no answer, he shifted Daniel to his shoulder and shouldered the door open. Inside, rain poured through the collapsed section of roof. The bed where Zara should have been sleeping was crushed beneath a massive branch. For one terrible moment, Owen thought he'd lost her, until a faint sound came from the corner. Zara was huddled there, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. "Owen," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Relief flooded through him as he helped her to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded, swaying slightly. "The roof just gave way. We need to get you out of here," Owen said, guiding her toward the door. The whole structure could collapse. They made their way through the storm to Owen's cabin, where he settled her at the table and lit every lamp he could find. Daniel, exhausted from crying, had fallen asleep against Owen's shoulder. He laid the baby in his crib before turning his attention to Zara's injury. The cut wasn't as bad as it had first appeared. Head wounds bled freely, but once Owen had cleaned away the blood with a damp cloth, he could see it was shallow. "You'll have a scar," he said softly, dabbing at the wound, "but you'll live." Zara's eyes met his, vulnerability plain in her gaze. "I was afraid of the storm, that you wouldn't come." She caught his hand, stilling its movement. "That I'd pushed you away too far." Owen's throat tightened. "I'll always come when you need me, Zara. Always." Something shifted between them in that moment. A barrier breaking down, a truth acknowledged. "I don't want to sell my land," she whispered. "But I don't want to stay there alone anymore either." Owen set aside the cloth and knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Then don't." He drew a deep breath. "Marry me, Zara. Not for convenience, not for protection. Marry me because in the few months I've known you, you've made me believe that life on the frontier doesn't have to mean isolation. That loss doesn't have to be the end of hope." Tears filled her eyes, mingling with the rainwater still clinging to her lashes. "Are you certain? You said you wouldn't risk your heart again." "I was wrong," Owen admitted. "The risk isn't in loving. It's in refusing to love out of fear. I've been more afraid of feeling something for you than I ever was of drought or fever or rustlers." A smile broke across her face like sunrise after the storm. "Then yes, Owen Ingram, I'll marry you." He gathered her into his arms, his heart fuller than he'd thought possible. From the crib came a soft coo, Daniel awake and watching them with curious eyes. "Look," Zara whispered, "he approves." 2 weeks later, they were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at the small settlement 10 miles from their property. The ceremony was simple, attended by the handful of neighbors scattered across the surrounding hills. Zara wore a dress of pale blue silk, the one fine garment she'd brought from the east, while Owen donned the one good suit he owned, last worn at Eliza's funeral. As they exchanged vows beneath a canopy of live oak, Owen felt the weight of the past year lifting. Daniel, dressed in his Sunday best, was passed among the neighboring women, cooing happily at all the attention. That night, after the neighbors had departed and Daniel was sleeping peacefully, Owen and Zara stood on the porch of what was now their shared home, looking out at the stars that blanketed the Texas sky. "I've been thinking," Owen said, his arm around his new wife's waist. "We should build a new cabin, bigger than either of ours, right between our two properties, joining them together properly." Zara leaned her head against his shoulder. "With a proper bedroom for Daniel when he's older. And maybe," she hesitated, then continued softly, "maybe space for more children, in time." Owen turned to look at her, wonder in his eyes. "Is that something you want? More children? With you?" "Yes." Her smile was both shy and certain. "This land should be filled with life, don't you think? To balance out the hardship." Inside, Daniel made a small sound in his sleep, and both of them instinctively looked toward the crib. But there was no wail, No cry of distress, just the peaceful breathing of a contented child. When Reed returned a month later with his men, he found not a vulnerable widow but a united family. Two properties joined into one, worked by 4 hands instead of 2. The water from Owen's well now irrigated fields that straddled both original claims, and the foundation was already laid for a new, larger cabin. The property's not for sale, Owen informed him firmly, standing beside Zara on their porch. Daniel balanced on her hip. Not now, not ever. Reed surveyed the scene, calculation in his eyes. But whatever he saw in the couple's united front convinced him this was a battle not worth fighting. With a curt nod, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following. "Do you think he'll be back?" Zara asked, watching the dust settle behind the departing riders. Owen shook his head. Men like Reed prey on isolation. We're not isolated anymore. As autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson, the new cabin took shape. Neighbors helped raise the walls and set the roof beams, repaying the assistance Owen and Zara had provided during calving season and harvest time. What had once been 2 lonely homesteads was becoming the heart of a small community. On Christmas Eve, with snow dusting the hills in a rare Texas white Christmas, they moved into their new home. The cabin was larger and sturdier than either of their original structures, with room for the family they hoped to build. Daniel, now toddling on unsteady legs, explored every corner with wide-eyed wonder. That night, after tucking Daniel into his new bed, Owen and Zara stood before the hearth, watching the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of returning east?" Zara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not for a moment. The frontier isn't just about what it takes from us, Owen. It's about what we build here, together." She placed her hand on her abdomen, a secret smile playing at her lips. "And we're just beginning to build." Understanding dawned in Owen's eyes. "Are you certain?" She nodded, joy illuminating her features. "Come spring, Daniel will have a brother or sister." Owen gathered her into his arms, his heart so full it seemed impossible it had ever known emptiness. Through the window, the Texas stars shone down on the cabin, a beacon of warmth and life in the vast frontier night. The baby who had once cried through endless nights now slept peacefully in his new room, secure in the knowledge that he was surrounded by love. The frontier had taken much from both of them, but what they had built together was stronger than any loss, more enduring than any hardship. In finding each other, they had discovered a truth that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead, that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its home.